keeping me back in the academic environment. Thank you. INTBAU and Faculty of Architecture, these joint events are generally on cultural heritage, and today I will be talking about a sort of cultural heritage that I consider as heritage but is generally not acknowledged as. So I will be talking about the vernacular-modern houses of rural Cyprus, especially rural Cyprus, because they're very much different from the urban examples. And we'll try to explain how the people and architects, if they ever existed, negotiated some aspects of modernity and left some away. So modernity and tradition are concepts that have many different definitions. So tradition, especially, when it comes to traditional architecture, we might not be talking about the same thing all the time, because when we say traditional architecture, you might think of, for example, if we're talking about houses, the wooden houses in Lefkoşa, for example, with bay windows in Surlariçi, are they traditional? If they are traditional, how is that tradition reflected in the rural? Aren't rural people the same people as the ones that lived in the city? Did they not share traditions? But traditional architecture is different from vernacular. Vernacular is easier to explain, but antiquity is another concept that comes into the equation here, because I work for the Department of Antiquities, and my specialty is modern architecture of the 20th century. So what do I do there, and how does it intersect? Well, I don't work on antiquities per se, but we have just started. The Department of Antiquities is also responsible for identifying all cultural heritage in building form. So when the identification is very important here, because it's a very political process. And who identifies what as heritage, who gives that evaluation is very, very political. And today I will be talking about why modern architecture in Cyprus should be actually acknowledged as cultural heritage. So vernacular is very easy to actually explain, because it is about the public. It's done with local materials, local know-how, and is considered more simple or less refined compared to the traditional that it is, I have to put in quotes, the traditional that we see, the fancy buildings of the past in generally city centers, or we can also think of provincial castles in England, for example. And modern is the break from it, the break from everything. Modernism was introduced as a different concept, and it had to be revolutionary in the first half of the 20th century. So Le Corbusier and his contemporaries came with a very, very different approach to architecture. And my favorite definition is by Marshall Berman in his book. So to be modern is to live a life of paradox and contradiction. It is contradictory because it is it has to be a revolution. You can't be a little modern. Or that's what they said. Le Corbusier and his buddies expected that if you are going modern, you have to break off with all tradition. And it has to be both revolutionary and conservative. And there is this contradiction all along. That's why some say that modernism didn't really work, because it was a revolution and it didn't take into consideration cultural aspects. Sorry, there has to be an image, but anyway. Well, this presentation is based on my PhD research, which was on the refugee housing, post-war refugee housing in Cyprus. It is a bit of a long story, but I will just give a little insight into it for our international guests here, because Cyprus is a different example. Ah, okay, well. Sorry, there had to be an image here, but I will try to give you an idea that in 1974 the island of Cyprus was divided into two segments, two ethno-national segments, and the refugees that I'm talking about are the Turkish Cypriots that had to flee from the south into the north, and they moved into the abandoned houses that were left by the Greek Cypriots. So they moved into their enemies' houses. Those were their shelters, because they didn't need to build shelters, because in this case there was a population exchange, and the population of the Greek Cypriots leaving were much more than the Turkish Cypriots that were coming to the north. So they had many houses to choose from, and most of them were modernist rural houses that I will be talking about. Now, these are the iconic modernist houses, the real, the high modern, the sophisticated ones that we know. This catered only to the rich, of course. The lower income people got to know modernism through much less flashy collective housing projects like these. These are from similar periods. So you can see that they're both modern, but the difference is that this is the fashionable one, and this is the top-down imposition by the states. This is cheap housing for the workforce, and they did not supply the best comfort conditions. So, but in Cyprus, modernism didn't come like that, because we didn't have an industrial revolution, we didn't have industries, our population wasn't that high, and we never really needed those huge blocks of social housing. In the same time period as these, Cypriot wealthy people were having architects to produce such masterworks in the cities. And this is much later actually. It is important because this is from 49, which is during the British colonial era. And these are from the 70s, which is during the independent era. So what I'm getting at is that during this time, we didn't have many modernist buildings around, modernist civic buildings around, because the British colonial administration wasn't very keen on it. They kept on building with the colonial style. But with 1960, when Cypriots gained their independence from Great Britain, they started building. And they started building very, very modern. So these were the modern in the urban environments. By the way, these are all Greek Cypriot houses, Greek Cypriot architects, and there is a reason for it. I will tell you about that right now, actually. because in 63, okay, 74 was when the island was divided completely into two segments, but in 63, because of intercommunal violence, Turkish Cypriots withdrew into enclaves. So these red patches that you see are the Turkish Cypriots enclaves, and they were like compounds that were very strictly controlled by the Greek Cypriot police. So this is why is this important for us? It is very important for our architectural production as well, because they didn't allow... I shouldn't have touched it. Oh, okay, sorry. Yeah, too smart for me. Okay, so construction materials were not allowed into those enclaves. So Turkish Cypriots, they kept on marrying and having children in those enclaves, but they couldn't build more. So they were just piling up in the existing buildings. For example, my mother is a refugee, and she was living somewhere around here in Lefkara. In 63, they had to move to, I think, here, to Kofinu, and they were lucky they weren't living in a tent, because some people were living in tents for years. But they had, they knew a relative of a relative who gave a small room that they used as a chicken pen or something to them, and there were 6 children and 2 parents, 8 people in one room. So they couldn't even live in that room, of course. So they had to, my grandparents had to distribute the kids to other houses in the village. Imagine that every night they would say good night and go to another relative's house, because that room couldn't house them. And they couldn't build more because building materials were not accessible. At the same time, between 63 and 74, when Turkish Cypriots were completely dormant and they weren't building anything, Greek Cypriots were very successfully building everything in the modernist, so this is 64, and that is 64 as well. So you can see the difference in technology and approach to architecture. Imagine 10, 11 years, Turkish Cypriots were in those enclaves with very limited technology and a lot of restrictions. And Greek Cypriots kept on living as they were very good at architectural production as well. They were building hotels. You see Maraş, the Varosha region, you see those buildings? They were building those. So it was very interesting, like a parallel universe. They didn't know what Turkish Cypriots were doing, where they were living. But but in 74, see if you can see it, there was this population exchange, and Turkish Cypriots went into this Greek Cypriot free zone into the north and found all those empty houses left by the Greek Cypriots. And it wasn't like anything they had remembered. Mind you, the last buildings that they remembered, that they lived in, the proper ones, were either the vernacular buildings like these. By the way, I'm talking about rural populations only. Or like what my mother had to live in just a room. But they came, these buildings that I will show you are all from rural villages. So they came in 74 and found this in Tuzla, right here. And this also in Tuzla. See, this is very much different from the refined, very artistic creation that I showed you from the 40s even. But that was the more high modernism. But these show that Greek Cypriots were still living in villages, but they were yearning to be fashionable, modern. And when they were building new, they didn't remember the vernacular techniques, the know-how, the materials. They all went for reinforced concrete. So, and of course, there's a great difference now between anything that was before 20th century and the 20th century, because now, 20th century, well, post-war, I will say, post-Second World War, everything was more mobile. The mobility changed. People could move between social classes. They could be born in a farmer's house, but they could become, they could go to university and become something else, earn more money. But they could also sit in their village and import the technology from the city and the styles from the city, the know-how, the laborers. These are all from Tuzla. This is also from Tuzla. These are how they interpreted those very fancy urban modernist houses and went modern, didn't even look back. There's nothing that is technically traditional here. All those builders had no chance of applying their techniques. For example, look at, this is from Çayırova village. This is a very modest example, but it is still the same technology. You see that these people didn't have the money or the artistic approach to it. They just wanted a place with a roof on it. But they went for the reinforced concrete, flat roof, that I'm sure they regretted later, because yes, they did have the technology, but there was no insulation. So I lived in houses like these. It's not nice. But still, even when they didn't have the money or the vision, they still went for this. It seems like reinforced construction had wiped out the vernacular techniques by that time. This is from Tuzla again. This is from Çayırova. So you see very modest buildings, but still. And what I'm trying to get at here is that one of, well, the best known Turkish Cypriot architect, modernist, Ahmet Bahaddin, I'm sure you know because you had an event about him recently. He was a very true modernist, very strict modernist, and when he designed everything about that house. Because modernist architects, they saw themselves as gods. And modernism had this very strict definition of what things are, what spaces are. And in another event, here actually, I remember one of his clients telling the story that he would come and check the gardens of his clients. And if he found something, a plant that is like parsley, for example, that is so traditional, so rural. If you want parsley, you go and buy it from a farmer. A farmer's job is to raise the parsley, and not yours, because you're urban, you're not rural. So there is this very strict differentiation there. But these people, all of these villages, they were still villagers. Behind those, every one of those houses I went to, they had chicken pens. They had sometimes goats. They always had something edible, the plants, not just ornamental. And this one is a very typical, this is the same house. This is the side of the house. So this, again, vernacular house belonged to the parents, and when they had one of their oldest son, they had this one made. And they kept living in that house. And I don't have pictures of it, but it's impossible for us when we have adjusted ourselves to the comfort conditions of these houses. It's impossible to live in those mud brick houses where soil is just falling from everywhere. It's so difficult to clean and difficult to ventilate because it's not reinforced concrete, the openings are small. You don't have proper plumbing at all, and the toilet was somewhere here in the back as a pit toilet. So this is what I'm trying to say, that they were pretty okay living in there, but when they were building new, they were building very new. And the negotiation part. So you like modernism, you like the flashy, fashionable part of it, but you don't want everything about it because it doesn't suit you. But that's not what Le Corbusier would say, or Ahmed Bahaddin. But these rural people couldn't care less. They just took whatever they liked about modernism and they just left the rest. This is possibly one of the smallest kitchens that I found in those villages that I studied. See, oh, no, I should have had, okay. Do you remember Frankfurt kitchen? Please say yes. The Frankfurt kitchen is this very narrow, very rational, and only functional space that is designed, that was designed by a woman. She was an architect, but I have to say that, unfortunately I don't have the image, but that every centimeter of that kitchen was engineered. And I'm using that word consciously because it was engineered and it was not architectural design, because it didn't make people happy. And while it was very, very rational, it did not take culture into consideration. And food preparation has always been a cultural event for us, right? But in the Frankfurt kitchen is designed only for one person, one robot, to reach everywhere. When a woman would open her arms, she would touch everywhere. So she wouldn't even have to walk really, but she would do everything so quickly because she was a robot, obviously. But no. So we did have, for example, Ahmed Bahaddin did design such tiny rational kitchens in Lefkoşa for those rich clients. But these people, they didn't care about that. And when they were modernizing, they kept some things out as well. For example, this is from the same village. These thick walls, you see this is the traditional, well, vernacular traditional, okay, you see this is this huge, no, don't go back, huge arch that spans the whole space. And this space is everything that modernist spaces aren't, because modernist spaces are defined strictly. Kitchen is only for food preparation. You can't take your peas into the living room to shell them, because that's dirty work and that is just socializing. But this space, big space, they had the kitchen, the dining room, and the living room, because it's a huge space, and they had beds, no separation in between, because obviously they only had one space to warm in the winter, for example. And it was easy. This is the sundurma that opens up into the backyard. And this, I said kitchen, but it was just a niche, actually, that food preparation, cooking was done in. So the fire was here. And they built this reinforced concrete home next to it. Oh, sorry about the images. I hope the rest. This is that reinforced concrete building that is attached to this. It's very difficult to take all of them together because of vegetation, but the modernism was all about the whiteness, the cleanliness, the over-cleanliness actually, all those hospital-like buildings. And they don't have a wet space. This is their wet space. Oh, this. So when they were really negotiating, I don't know the rationale behind the owners of that building, because I've never met them, because they don't exist anymore in this park. But they built a proper house and then left out any sanitary functions, which was shocking. And the refugees, the Turkish Cypriots, used this for at least a decade until they converted one of the balconies into a makeshift bathroom. But not everyone was like that. There is this very specific thing about the Turkish Cypriot modern bathrooms. They're all in pieces. If you have been to an old house, the Greek Cypriot houses, or the Turkish Cypriot houses that were built in the 90s, up until the 90s, people were so used to this that they kept separating the bathroom fixtures. The wash basin was always somewhere accessible by everyone, no door, just in the way. And then the bath was in another room, and the toilet bowl in another room. This is a very typical plan. So you have the wash basin right in the way, and then the separated bathtub and the toilet bowl. This, I'm showing you, these are all Twyfords, by the way. This is the original one. These people ended up changing everything later, but this was still the Twyfords. I grew up in 3 different houses with Twyford sets. These were sold as sets with the bidets, but bidets were not used, so they would just remove it and plant flowers in them. But this is how Twyfords advertised these sets. They were supposed to be together, as we have them most in our most homes now, right? But no, rural Cypriots said that this is disgusting, and this is for cleaning, so it should be somewhere else, and this is dirty, and it should be somewhere else, and the bath is also for cleaning, and it should be somewhere else. So they ended up creating different spaces for all of them. You see, these are all changed, but they're still the same system, because they're so used to it. This is another accessible, because possibly it's a farming community, and when you come from the outside, normally you would wash outside because they didn't have wet spaces inside. But now, if I am, this is the negotiation part. If I'm taking wet spaces inside, I want the dirty ones really hidden, and I don't want to touch a door when I have soil on my hands, for example. This is negotiation that you couldn't do with Ahmet Bahattin, for example. He would never negotiate. So if they're doing it very new, they're still doing it. This is an extension. This is one of the houses, one other house that didn't originally have a toilet or bathroom. So the refugees, when they had the money, they built an extension, and they still didn't put them in all one room. So, what I was trying to say is that modernism is a style that was very much applied pretty much the same way around the world at a certain period. But in Cyprus, the rural part of Cyprus, I say that it was very much their own modernity. and we inherited it from our enemies. So when you inherit something, it is heritage. And when you look at these houses that I showed you, they don't look like what UNESCO would say, that they have this list of what counts as cultural heritage. It must be substantial, significant. And those buildings are not. But I'm not talking about the individual buildings, but the style was so prevalent. It wiped out the vernacular building techniques. It was so prevalent that I think it just wrote the architectural history of that decade. And really, rural Cypriots did negotiate with modernity, and they chose the aspects that they liked, and they just didn't accept those that didn't like. And as I say, villages full of these buildings, that as the texture of it is very significant, because that is not very much seen in the rural around the world. So Cyprus is a very significant case. However, even Greek Cypriots, also Turkish Cypriots, they don't recognize these ordinary modern buildings as heritage at all, because we have, I'm proud to say that my department has started very, very slowly to list some modernist buildings as cultural heritage, so they can't be torn down anymore. But those are all in the cities, and they're very substantial buildings. For example, one of them is in Mausa, the kindergarten building in Palm Beach area. I went to that when I was 5, and many other people in Mausa. And now it is listed, it's not under protection, it's in a very bad condition, but it is, again, an iconic building. That's why it has been preserved. But there is a problem with, I have with Cypriots and with my department, that we are crazy about all the remains of our colonizers. We value them so much, but we forget that the real Cypriot production started from, well, the half of the 20th century, and the modernism was very, very Cypriot. And the one in the rural is, I would say, the most Cypriot, because the high modern in the cities were mostly yearning for the European contemporaries. But the ones in the rural are very, very Cypriot. And they are the vernacular of their time, because, well, it wasn't the local material or local know-how, but then again, with the mobility, as I said, everything became local in a way. And I will leave you with this, just to show you how Cypriots, this is a ubiquitous image you see everywhere in the souvenir shops. And you see, you can't see it, but okay. This says historical dates, and it's the Byzantine period. Richard the Lionheart, very important guy. The Lusignan. Okay, this smart thing. The Lusignan period. It was a very important period, really. A lot of buildings. The Venetians, again, the same. Turkish. British occupation, and then history of Cyprus ends. For some reason, the independent Cypriots don't matter, that we don't advertise it to the tourists because, well, it's not old enough. But no, today is history, so yesterday is very much history, and I think we should be recognizing what we have done in the last half a century. And it is our own production and should be preserved and at least recognized.